Hi, you got me. This is O'Connor. Welcome back, week 4. And this is one of the important weeks called Preventing Fraud. And here we have the learning objectives. That is to understand how to create a culture of honesty, openness, and assistance, how to eliminate opportunities for fraud, understand how to create an effective organization to minimize fraud, and understand the importance of proactive fraud auditing, and finally, the importance of creating a comprehensive approach to fighting fraud. Now, get this, if organizations implemented everything that we say in this chapter, there'll be no need for any other chapters in the whole textbook, because if you can prevent fraud from the get-go, then you don't have to detect it, you don't have to investigate it, and you don't have to prosecute it. So get this chapter is quite important for that very reason. And as we know, with our nice little pyramid, if you invest a single dollar into fraud prevention, you're going to save multiple dollars down the track fighting fraud, fraud investigation, and prosecuting fraud, taking fraudsters to court and all that sort of thing. So it's much easier to invest in fraud prevention. And that is why this chapter, chapter 4, is probably one of the most important chapters in the whole textbook. Note this, I will be showing some data from the report to nations, and I think that's pretty important for us to grasp, because it's given data on what's been happening in the last 18 months to 2 years around the world. And if we can bring some data to bear to the different theories and frameworks, then that makes your learning outcomes so much more tractable. Okay, so let's get into it, shall we? All right, so just about everyone can be dishonest. As I said in previous weeks, maybe 10% of people will never commit fraud, 80% of people might commit fraud depending on the situation, and 10% of people are actively looking to commit fraud all the time. All right, and then there was another study that was done back in 1989 to say that in USA, 30% of people are dishonest, 40% are situationally honest, and then 30% are honest all the time. And these are pretty old studies or pretty old investigations of the demeanor of populations around the world. I'd be very interested to know what the situation is today, especially in the USA, in Australia, in the other parts of the Western world, especially. All right, so the big point about this data is that when placed in an environment of low integrity, poor controls, loose accountability, or high pressure, people tend to become increasingly dishonest. And that's why this chapter, Preventing Fraud, is all about minimizing the opportunities for fraud from the get-go. Let's get into this. Now, as you can see, there are two parts to the whole notion of preventing fraud. Number one, creating a culture of honesty, openness, and assistance. Number two, eliminating fraud opportunities. Now, let's deal with the first one. We call it Part A, and then down the track in the PowerPoint slides, we're going to look at Part B, eliminating fraud opportunities, drawing on data from the report to nations as we go through. Now, there's three big parts that we're going to look at: hiring honest people, creating a positive work environment, and providing an employee assistance program for the first Part A of creating a culture of honesty, openness, and assistance. And so we can talk about hiring practices until the dogs come home. What we mean is that everyone at some point in time has been hired into an organization. So if we get the hiring right, we're going to get the better 30% of people in a population for a certain skill set right that we need for our organization. So what we have here is, if we can verify all the information, if we can require all applicants to certify that their information is accurate, and if we can train those involved in the hiring process, and maybe use industry-specific or other approaches as deemed necessary, then it's likely that we can have good preventative measures as part of the hiring policies and practices. And that's not to forget, provide fraud awareness training in the hiring process, on the onboarding process when people are hired. So how important is this? I want to show you some data to explain to you how important hiring practices are. There are two parts of data here. If we look at right over on your left-hand side, here are examples of people who were hired, big ticket people, and they lied on their resume. They lied in going to a university. They lied in saying they had a PhD when they didn't. They just blatantly lied. In the end, the outcome, only two of them, the two highlighted ones, got some kind of criminal sanction. That is, there was 5 years probation. The other one got 14 months imprisonment. Obviously, it's not high on the criminal prosecution list to go after people who fraudulently lie on their CVs. Although the rest of these candidates, they did lose their job, but they were able to pick up employment elsewhere in no short period of time. So there's not many big penalties out there. The only real victim is actually the organization that hired that fraudulent person to begin with. All right, let's have a look at some other data from the report to nations, and notice that out of the more than 1,500 cases that they picked up around the world, 2023, 2022, notice that 43% of those organizations did not do a background check. Wow. Did the background check reveal existing red flags? 16% of the time, yes, it did. And so that could have avoided many frauds. And if you look at the data behind me, what type of background checks were run on the perpetrator prior to hiring? For those that 57% of organizations that did a background check, they looked at employment history. They did criminal check. They did education verification. They did reference checks, credit checks, drug screening, and other. So you can see companies are doing background checks, but not enough of them. Less than 2/3 of companies where fraud was picked up by this report to nations conducted a background check. Wow. All right. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. Okay, what can we do next? Create a positive work environment. And that means having a good corporate code of conduct, open door, easy access policies, and positive personnel and operating procedures. Here is a code of conduct example for Hommel Foods. And this is provided in chapter 3 of our beloved textbook. And it just shows how broad the code of conduct is, from sexual harassment, safety, to gifts, corporate opportunities, foreign trade, proper accounting, insider trading, fair dealing, covering just about everything. And it is possible that organizations could provide a short training module on any one of these areas, and maybe ask employees to sign a conflict of interest in any one of these deemed areas that they felt were a risk to the operations of the organization. So that's the code of conduct. Next, we have implementing employee assistance programs, and this is to do with the well-being of the employee associated with substance abuse, gambling, money management, health, family, and personal problems. Now, at any one point in time, we do go into having health or family or personal problems. It does happen. It does strike us from one time or another. There is no perfect employee. So a good workplace is one that understands that employees may go through these periods from time to time, and then to provide support in the terms of wellness, team building, coaching, conflict resolution, assessment, counseling, and different referral procedures. Wow. So there you have it. You've got the hiring, you've got the code of conduct, and you've got implementing employment assistance programs are pretty important in creating a culture of honesty, openness, and assistance. What we want to do now is move on to look at eliminating opportunities for fraud to occur. And as I go through these different steps, or the different areas that organizations should put in place, I will hopefully show you some data in support of these different areas. So there are 5 methods that we're going to go through here: having good internal controls, discouraging collusion, monitoring employees, creating an expectation of punishment. Yes, that is important. And conducting proactive auditing. Each of these methods does reduce either the actual or the perceived opportunity to commit fraud. So let's have a look at them in turn. The first area is having a good system of internal controls. And as you can see from the data on the report of nations, 32% of the organizations where fraud was committed did not have, or they lacked, good internal controls. Or they had an override of existing internal controls, 19%. They had a lack of management review, 18%. They had a lack of competent personnel in oversight roles, 9%. And then there was a poor tone at the top, 8%, and a lack of independent checks and audits, 5%. So you can see that this is ripe for allowing fraud to take place. And as you can see by the data, it's saying that if companies did have stronger internal controls, then it's less likely that fraud would have taken place. So what do we mean by internal controls? Well, according to the Committee of Sponsoring Organisations, that is COSO, and their framework, it's all about a good control environment, risk assessment process, a set of control activities, information and communication system, and a process of monitoring compliance with the controls. So having a good system of internal controls. Now, another way of looking at control activities, which is associated with having a good system of internal controls, is this notion of SAPID, S-A-P-I-D. SAPID referring to separation of duties. 2, authorizations, P, physical controls, 4, independent checks, I, and D, documentation. If you have all of these in place, then that will help ring fence, make stronger what internal controls you have in place already. Wow. This is what contributes to a good internal control system. SAPID. Do remember that. Let's have a look at the second idea associated with eliminating fraud opportunities, and that is discouraging collusion between employees and others. What do we mean by collusion? Does it matter? Well, I just pulled out of the largest financial frauds that took place in the last 20 or more years, and here we've got 3, 6, 9, 12, 11 of them. Out of the 32 that I have compiled, 11 of them were associated with collusion out of the 32. And of course, we see the big ones like Enron, WorldCom, Parmalat, and of course, Lehman Brothers was in there. Lehman Brothers executives use accounting loopholes, right? And colluded with banks to temporarily remove debt from the company's books. Like, that was a pure accounting fraud, but it required the collusion with banks, an external party to the organization. So when we talk about collusion, it can be between employees, or it can be between employees and outside the organization. Between employees, it was between the COO, the CFO, the chairman of the board of directors at Enron. That was between managers in Enron that created that collusion for the fraud to take place. With Lehman Brothers, it was collusion with an external bank. Wow. And you can see there are a number of banks where collusion had taken place, and it resulted in a huge fraud. And these huge frauds, I capped them at no less than $300 million US. So they're pretty big when it comes to the down and dirty of what is going on in today's area of collusion. Discouraging collusion. What is next with it eliminating fraud opportunities? The next is monitoring employees and having a whistleblowing system. Now, after Enron and WorldCom and Sunbeam and these big fiascos at the turn of the century, the Sarbanes-Oxley was put into place. And under the Sarbanes-Oxley, it requires all publicly listed companies in the USA to have a secure whistleblowing system in place. And what they found was that a secure whistleblowing system is a perfect mechanism to help eliminate fraud opportunities, because they found approximately 33% of frauds are detected through tips, through whistleblowing. And that's Sarbanes-Oxley is something you'll hear more about when we talk about financial fraud later in this semester. Wow. Let's go on to number 4 of eliminating fraud opportunities, and that is creating an expectation of punishment. Now, why would we worry about the expectation of punishment? Well, if you expect to be caught and punished, it's less likely you're going to commit the crime, or in this case, commit the fraud. Is there data to show this? Well, if we look at the Report to Nations 2024 report of fraud cases that happen around the world, companies that had internal punishment policy were as follows. They had a termination clause if fraud occurred, 53%, 65% of managers were terminated for fraud, and 70% of employees were terminated for fraud. And if we talk about the cases in which fraudsters were referred to crime authorities, the police, 57% of cases resulted in a criminal referral. Now, what we're going to learn later on with fraud investigation, it is important to do a proper investigation before you can just go and refer the matter to the police. Ideally, get a confession, get evidence, because the police or the government authorities, the Department of Justices, are not going to prioritise an organisational fraud over public crime that they are dealing with day in, day out, unless you have some written confession, unless you have surmountable evidence that they can prosecute and get the jury to say, without reasonable doubt, this guy needs to be punished. All right. So really, really important that you combine this policy of punishment, this policy of referral to criminal authorities, criminal busting authorities like the police, that you have a good fraud investigation policy and procedure in place, which we're going to learn about in coming chapters. And if you notice that 72% success rate of criminal referrals resulted in the perpetrator pleading guilty or being convicted. Now, that success rate, as I said, is likely because the company had a very good fraud examination process in place. Hence, that's why we got our textbook called Fraud Examination. The whole process of investigating and gathering evidence of a fraud. And there's many other bits of data to show that creating an expectation of punishment is really, really important to eliminate fraud opportunities. Now, let's go to our 5th area, and that is conducting proactive fraud auditing. And that is, a good fraud auditing involves 4 steps: identifying fraud risk exposures, like I said last week, shining the torch in areas where you feel that fraud is likely to occur. Is it with vendor management? Is it with the customer touch point? Is it with accounts receivable? Is it with sales? Identifying the fraud symptoms in each of these areas, the likely fraud symptoms, and we'll go into more detail into fraud symptoms in chapter 5 when we look at fraud detection. Next, build audit programs to proactively look for symptoms and exposures, and finally investigate fraud symptoms when they are identified. So there's the 5th key area of eliminating fraud opportunities. So what I want to do now is just re-summarize what we were talking about in this chapter, because if companies do everything on this page here, it is very likely that they can minimize the occurrence of fraud in the organization. Therefore, they don't need as much fraud detection energies and investment. They don't need fraud investigation, and they don't need fraud prosecution monies. And so they can save a whole bunch of money downstream if they invest in this simple bunch of procedures here under creating a culture of honesty, openness, and assistance, and eliminating fraud opportunities. So where are we going with this chapter 4 if we are saying that if companies do this, then they can actually cut out fraud altogether? We're going into this area, and that is we're trying to take companies from a position right over here of being reactive. That is, typically a fraud incident occurs. Then we're investigated. And then there's some action taken. And whether it's prosecution, whether you fire them, whether you admonish them, so forth. And then there's a resolution. Do you seek damages in a civil trial? So you get restitution, you get payback, so forth. And then it goes on and on again. You're not addressing the causes of the fraud incident to begin with. You are addressing the outcomes of a fraud incident. And most companies are in this reactionary mode where fraud becomes a recurring problem. What we want to do is move across to a proactive model like we have above, where we start to fight the causes of a fraud incident rather than the outcomes of a fraud incident. And the data is there right in the middle from the report to the nations saying that after a fraud occurred, companies, 82% of them modified their anti-fraud controls following the fraud. In other words, 82% of the companies moved from a reactive type model across to a proactive model above. And so this is why you need to really absorb these trends and these perspectives of Chapter 4. Are you going to teach the organization you work for to be reactive? Or during this course, you're going to learn the mechanisms and the tools and the ideas to help bring a company from being reactive to proactive. And being proactive, what we mean is having the right tone at the top, as I said in the last chapter last week, education and training, having integrity, risk and controls, reporting and monitoring, proactive fraud detection, and investigation and follow-up. So you're really focusing on trying to understand where fraud likely is to occur, what are the symptoms that would highlight that occurrence, and then trying to focus on reducing the motivations and the incentives associated with conducting such fraud acts in the first place. So there you have it, moving from a reactive model to a proactive model. There is Chapter 4. There is fighting fraud, stopping fraud in a nutshell for the whole textbook. If organizations get this chapter right, there's no need to read the rest of the textbook. That's possibly right. But most organizations don't do what we are saying in Chapter 4. So let's get stuck into it and learn it. See you in class and enjoy Chapter 4. Bye for now.